when you come to Alaska and you do one of these Southeast Island black bear hunts, the tides down here in a lot of these islands swing a lot. You might have a 20-foot elevation difference between high tide and low tide. And one of the complications you end up with, and I think if you go back to our On Your Own Adventures season 3, you'll see what happens when the tides or winds screw you up. Our boat ended up high and dry. So always grab a tide book. Every little town has the tide book. Find out where you're at, okay? If it's not one of the listed ports, then know that, okay, I'm 20 minutes plus or minus a catch a can or whatever it might be. And that tide book will tell you when it's low tide, when it's high tide. It'll tell you also how much the low tide is as far as from zero. Is it a negative tide? How much is the high tide as a positive tide? You always want to know if you're on an incoming tide or an outgoing tide, because that will affect how and where you anchor your boat. So you see a bear, okay, I want to go after him. You get downwind, it's an incoming tide. Well, with an incoming tide, unless you're going to be there a long time, the tide's rising, you can tie your boat off, you're probably not going to end up high and dry. Okay, you see a bear and it's almost high tide and you know it's going to the low tide. In other words, it's going to be an outgoing tide. Well, you got to figure out how to anchor your boat out there so that the wind doesn't blow it back to shore, and then when the tide goes out, you are high and dry. Or you can't just pull it up and take off, because you will be high and dry and you'll have to wait for the next tide to come back. My point is, you can prevent a mistake by paying attention to the tides. If you bring a buoy ball and a pulley, there's ways that you can do this. Go online and there's people who've talked about it. You buoy your anchor, you put a pulley on the buoy ball, and then you just kind of have a feeder rope where you can pull your boat in or pull it out, depending on what the tide situation is. So tides are definitely something that are gonna impact your Alaska black bear hunt if you come to the Southeast Islands. The good part is, for me anyhow, my experience shows that most of the bears I see are at low tide. Even if it's the middle of the day, be out there. So that's a little bit about tides. It just takes some thought, some consideration. And if you don't think it through or you get in a hurry, plan on waiting around for a while, because the tide will come back in.